الرحمن الرحيم مالك يوم الدين إياك نعبد وإياك نستعين اهدنا الصراط المستقيم صراط الذين أنعمت عليهم غير المغضوب عليهم ولا الضالين اللهم صل وسلم وبارك على سيدنا ونبينا أميرنا مولانا وشفينا وحبيبنا محمد طه ياسين حميم خاتم النبيين مرسل رحمة للعالمين رب العالمين صلى الله عليه وآله وسلم سلام على جميع الأنبياء والمرسلين وجميع الملائكة المقربين وعلى آل الكساء وآل البيت الكرام وأصحابه المخلصين وتبعين وتبعهم وأولياء الله الصالحين وعلماء المتقين والشهداء المطهرين وجميع مشايخنا وربنا المرشدين إلى الله تعالى سبحان ربك رب العزة عما يصفون والسلام على المرسلين والحمد لله رب العالمين وعما بعد. Alhamdulillah, this is the second part of the program on Hassan Sabah, inshallah, and we'll begin as usual with Quran reading by Sayyid Ahmed Murtaza, inshallah.
السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته.
وعليكم السلام.
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. شهد الله أنه لا إله إلا هو والملائكة وأولو العلم قائما بالقسط لا إله إلا هو العزيز الحكيم. إن الدين عند الله الإسلام وما اختلف الذين أوتوا الكتاب إلا من بعد ما جاءهم العلم بغيا بينهم ومن يكفر بآيات الله فإن الله سريع الحساب. فإن حاجوك فقل أسلمت وجهي لله ومن اتبعني وقل الذين أوتوا الكتاب والأمين أسلمتم فإن أسلموا فقد اهتدوا وإن تولوا فإنما عليك البلاغ والله بصير بالعباد. إن الذين يكفرون بآيات الله ويقتلون النبيين بغير حق ويقتلون الذين يأمرون بالقسط من الناس فبشرهم بعذاب أليم. أولئك الذين هبطت أعمالهم في الدنيا والآخرة وما لهم من الناصرين. ألم تر إلى الذين أوتوا نصيبا من الكتاب يدعون إلى كتاب الله يدعون إلى كتاب الله ليحكم بينهم ثم يتولى فريق منهم وهم معرضون ذلك بأنهم قالوا لن تمسنا النار إلا أياما معدودات وغرهم في دينهم ما كانوا يفترون فكيف إذا جمعناهم ليوم لا ريب فيه ووفيت كل نفس ما كسبت وهم لا يظلمون قل اللهم مالك الملك قل اللهم مالك الملك تؤتي الملك من تشاء وتنزع الملك ممن تشاء وتعز من تشاء وتذل من تشاء بيدك الخير إنك على كل شيء قدير تولج الليل في النهار وتولج النهار في الليل وتخرج الحي من الميت وتخرج الميت من الحي وترزق من تشاء بغير حساب صدق الله مولانا العظيم وصدق رسوله النبي الكريم اللهم نسوح وحشة القبر اللهم ارحمني بالقرآن العظيم واجعله لي إماما ونورا وهدى ورحمة اللهم ذكرنا مما نسيت وألمني مما جهلت وارزقني تلاوته أناء الليل وأناء النهار وجهت يا رب العالمين وبلغ ثواب ما قرأنه ونور ما تلاني وخدية وسيلة لا روح السيد النبي أميرنا مولانا محمد رسول الله عليه الصلاة والسلام وأهل بيت الأطهار وأولياء الله الصالحين وجميع مشايخنا مربينا مرشدين إلى الله تبارك بإحسانه وإيمان الشرع جزاك الله خير.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. So this begins the second part of the talk on, and the substantive part on the talk on Sabah. And as I told you, and I've told people that I was giving this talk, and they were very surprised that I would talk about Sabah, and they had nothing very much good to say about him. But I hope that this talk will change your opinion of him, and I will proceed really by telling all the lies and the myths and the sensationalism and so forth first, so you get an idea of why they wondered why I would give a talk on such a bad person in their estimation. So I remind you the words of a writer of the book 1984, George Orwell, who said that who controls the past controls the future, and who controls the present controls the past. Again, who controls the past controls the future. Who controls the present controls the past. So I would again suggest that anybody reading or listening to this bayan, go back and listen and read the bayan on Nasr Khusro to better understand the background before listening to this. The reason for all of this, of course, is it is not really possible to understand Sabah without some deep grounding in Ismailism, which I tried to give in my talk prior to this morning, and in Fatima's thought specifically. In that original bayan, I mentioned the saying of Winston Churchill, who was a contemporary of George Orwell, from a different side of the ideological tracks, but who mentioned much along the same lines as these, that, quote, history is written by the victors, end quote. So the story of Hassan Sabah, as is known by most people, is written by the people who were victorious over him, the Turks, Seljuk, and also in modern times the Sunnis, and to a certain degree even the Shia, who don't have much of a liking for him either. And this has been the case, really, this negative view of him since the time of Salahuddin Ayyubi, who is better known in the West as Salahuddin or Saladin, who was the first sultan at the end of the Fatimid rule in Egypt and Syria, and more or less the founder of the Ayyubid dynasty, who put an end to the Fatimid rule in 567 Hijri, or 1171 in the Common Era. Also, the grandson of Chinggis Khan, Hulagu Khan, and his Mongol raiders, who in 1256, almost 100 years later, destroyed Alamut, which was the fortress or the temporary autonomous zone of Hassan Sabah, and most importantly to us, ordered the destruction and the burning of the library there, and of course the library in Baghdad. But the library in Alamut, Hassan Sabah had painstakingly put together over time, and this contained really the basic texts of the Fatimi Khilafah, and what was the mission of what they called the Da'wah, which is what they called their movement, the calling, which was really to convert, their idea was to convert, or as I said, to return people to the Asani Taqweem on a personal level, but to convert total darkness at every level into light. This was their ideal. And in every cycle of history, as history is secular, and is marked by the Ulul Azm that we mentioned in the beginning, these 6 prophets. He created the world in 6 things in 6 days. Well, of course, that's not what it refers to. It refers to Sidna Adam alayhi salam, and Sidna Nuh alayhi salam, Sidna Ibrahim alayhi salam, Sidna Isa alayhi salam, and Sidna Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wasallam. These are the 6 periods during which Allah has created, subhanahu wa ta'ala, the world that we live in these 6 times. Sitati Ayam, He created in 6 days. People try to understand days and things like that. That's useless to try and understand it that way. It's in 6 periods. And these are the periods of these in which because you have to understand that Adam and Hawa don't come from the earth. We don't come from this world. We are the children of Adam and Hawa, alayhum salam, and they did not come from this world. They came from another world, which we conveniently call the garden, the Jannah. So they came here, and it took 6 of these grand cycles in which this world was created. It's still being created. But a certain phase of it is finished with the coming of Sayyidina Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, who was Khatam al-Anbiya and sealed all of the prophecy. There's no more prophecy after that. Now we live in the world of wilayat, and we're living in the last part of the night and the beginning of the dawn of this new age, which is the age of Al-Mahdi, alayhi salam. That's the seventh world, the world of Al-Mahdi, alayhi salam. These cycles will continue even after that, because that again will go back into another, because there's cycles upon cycles. And all of this will continue to go until all of matter is turned into light. All of matter. All matter that exists, as we say, will be turned back into the best of forms. And the best of forms is light. And that is what will ultimately prevail. Remember when Khadija radiallahu ta'ala anha asked the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, who couldn't read formally, he was Ummi in that sense, when Jibreel revealed the Quran, he said, how did you read it? And he said, because the order is Iqra, read, he said, it was as though the words were written in light upon my heart. And also when he went past Sidrat al-Muntaha and he left Sidna Jibreel behind, he went beyond Sidna Jibreel and Sidrat al-Muntaha in the Miraj, and Allah taught him to pray, and all of those things happened. His conversation was with light. And light is ultimate consciousness. Light can speak if you know how to listen. If you can listen, you know how to listen, you can hear the light speaking. And in that way, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala spoke, of course, to Musa, and he spoke to the Rasulullah in this form, and taught him this most important part of our lives, which is our salah. The custodians of literal, legal, ex post facto prophecy, the legatees of social political Islam, have done everything they could to shroud and hide the name of the Fatimids. As I told you, I was amazed last time when I was going to talk about this, and there's a young sister here who's working on an advanced degree at the university in Islamic studies. She knew nothing, next to nothing about the Fatimids except that they weren't very good. That's all she knew. That's what they knew. That's the way it's been dealt with. So these custodians of the literal, legal, ex post facto prophecy, that is, the people whose teachings mainly are an endless regurgitation of 4th and 5th century thought. They've never really gotten beyond 4th and 5th century thought. And all of, the fiqh and all of this stuff is a regurgitation and a constantly recycling of a long time ago, and also of a lot of people who were misogynist men of that time, didn't like women very much. You can see that when you read through the all of the hadith. You can see their hand in it, because this is written by men. None of it written by women. Yes, of course, there are the hadith that are attributed to Aisha radiallahu ta'ala anha, but they're recorded by men. And these men, which I refer to as the custodians of that, who are the legatees of socio-political Islam, not spiritual Islam, social-political Islam, have done everything that they could do, as far as I've been able to understand, to shroud the name of these Fatimids and reduce them to utter obscurity, casting doubt upon their sincerity, the truth of their Islam, which is that it doesn't matter in the end, as I said, who you are in the world. It doesn't matter who you are, whether you're a king or a man who shines shoes. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter if you have $1 billion or you're homeless and you have no money. much as that they'd like to teach you that the only people who matters are the people who have a lot of money and boats and yachts, and they can go here and they can go there, and they have power over everybody. These are the people who you have been taught are the people in power. And this is what the aim of life is to become one of these people. But if you have not returned to that place in which Allah created you, you can have all the money in the world, you can have houses, you can have wives, you can have children, they all can become doctors, and you can have all the money, you can have everything imaginable in the world. It doesn't mean anything. Unless you could have those things, you could have them, they're not wrong, they're not bad, but without a return of your being to that fitra upon which you were created, all of that is meaningless. It doesn't matter whether you're black or white or red or yellow or brown, or you're this or you're that, or you're Shia or you're Sunni or you're Sufi or you're Salafi or you're whatever. All that is meaningless. Meaningless. Nice, but meaningless. The only thing that has any meaning is whether you are living in that asani taqweem in which Allah created you, in that fitra in which Allah created you. Then life has meaning. Everybody else, summan, bukman, wa umyan, deaf, dumb, and blind. That's 85%, 95% of humanity, in truth. Muslim world, Jewish world, Christian world, Buddhist world, Hindu world, doesn't make any difference in that sense. What happened at Alamut inspired people to write fantastic stories about, because we don't have the actual real books since Hulugu ordered the library burned down, and the only person who recorded its contents, Juwaini, was not somebody who was particularly on our side. We don't really know what it was, what the teaching was, what his mission of Hassan Sabah was. So people have been free to make up these fantastic stories. For instance, here is a hyperbolic example of the 20th century, quote-unquote, Sufi author, whom most of you have heard about, called Idris Shah, writing under the pseudonym of Arkan Darao in his book, A History of Secret Societies, that was published by Citadel Press in 1961 and republished in 1989. I quote, here's how he starts. Two men in the year 1092 stood on the ramparts of a medieval castle called the Eagle's Nest. Boy, that's exciting. Perched high upon the crags of the Persian mountains, one of the personal representative of the emperor, and the other person was a veiled figure. Of course, you know, they love veiled figures with quote-unquote flowing robes and all those things. A veiled figure. And this is a Sufi who's writing this, you know, so I mean, this is not even a Tea Party guy, right? This is somebody supposedly on our side, who claimed, this veiled figure, who claimed to be the incarnation of God on earth. And I'll use the words exactly from his writing, God on earth. I don't know who God is. I know about Allah. I don't know anything about God. God say, I got you, something like that. I caught you, I got you, Anyway, his name was Hassan, son of Sabah. He was called the Sheikh of the Mountains, Sheikh al-Jabal. And he was the leader of, quote-unquote, the assassins. Assassins. Wow. And he spoke. And he says, you see, he was talking to the emperor who was with him. I mean, not the emperor, but a personal vizier, wazir, a representative of the emperor. And he says, look, you see that devotee who's standing guard on those turret top up there? You see that? And pointing up to the mountain by the fort. And he made a signal. And when he made the signal, the white-robed figure threw up his hands in salutation, and he cast himself 2,000 feet into the foaming torrent which surrounded the fortress. Never mind, there is no foaming torrent that surrounds the forest and in a fortress. And never mind that there's no 2,000 feet he could have fallen, but this is the story. He made a signal, and this guy threw himself off of that thing. And then he says to the representative of the emperor, the wazir, he says, I've got 70,000 men and women throughout Asia, and every one of them is ready to do my bidding. Can your master, Malik Shah, say the same? And he asked me to surrender to his sovereignty? This is your answer. Go. Because this man had come to tell him he had to surrender. Well, such a scene, this is quote unquote, such a scene may be worthy of the most exaggerated of horror films, and yet it took place in historical fact. Historical fact. The only quibble made by the chronicler of the time, and this is like hundreds and thousands of people who become interested in Sufism are reading this thing to understand about this thing. The only quibble made by the chronicler of the time was that Hassan's devotees really were not 70,000, but they were only 40,000. How this man Sabah came by this uncanny power, how his devotees struck terror into the hearts of men from the Caspian to the Egypt, is one of the most extraordinary of all tales of secret societies. Today, the secret of the Hashishin, the druggers, still exists in the form of the Ismailites, in parentheses, the author puts, whose undisputed chief, endowed by them with divine attributes, is the Aga Khan. Like many other secret cults, the assassin organization was based upon an earlier association. And in order to understand how they worked and what their objectives are, we must begin with the roots. Quote, and all of this is quote, direct quote. It must be remembered that the followers of Islam in the 7th century split into two divisions. The Orthodox, who regard Muhammad, who he doesn't even say sallallahu alayhi wa sallam after, but Muhammad, as the bringer of divine inspiration, and the Shia, who considered that Ali, his successor, the fourth Imam or the leader, was more important, and it is with these Shia that we are concerned with. Quote, continuing. From the beginning of the split in the early days of Islam, the Shia relied for survival upon secrecy, organization, and initiation. Although they were the minority party in Islam, they believed that they could overcome the majority and eventually the whole world by superior organization and power. And to this end, they started a number of societies which practiced secret rites, in which the personality of Ali was worshipped. Any Shia out there, you remember going and worshipping Ali? I don't think so. But anyway, that's what he's saying. And whose rank and file, that is, as common people, were trained to struggle above all things for the accomplishment of world dominion. And one of the most successful of these secret societies, which the Shia founded, was centered around the abode of learning, which we talked about earlier, Dar al-Hikmah in Cairo, which was the training ground for fanatics who were conditioned by the most cunning methods to believe in a special divine mission. And in order to do this, the original democratic Islamic ideas and socio-political, the original democratic Islamic ideas had to be overcome by skilled teachers acting under the orders of the Khalifa of the Fatimids who ruled Egypt at that time. Members were enrolled on the understanding that they were to receive hidden powers, they love hidden powers, timeless wisdom, which would enable them to become as important in life as their teachers. And the Khalifa saw to it that the instructors were no ordinary men. The supreme judge was one of them. Another was the commander-in-chief of the army. A third was a wazir of the court. There was no lack of applicants. In any country where the highest officials of the realm formed a body of teachers, one would find the same thing, the best of the best. That's my saying, best of best. Quoting back, classes were divided into study groups, some composed of men, others of women, some mixed men and women. All collectively were called the assemblies of wisdom, Majalisu Hikmah. All lessons were carefully prepared, written down, and submitted to the Imam for his seal. And at the end of the lecture, this is when we were talking about the Talim and the Majalis, the end of the lecture, all present kissed the seal. For did not the Imam claim direct descent from Muhammad through his son-in-law Ali, and thence from Ismail, the seventh Imam? He was the embodiment of divinity, more than any Tibetan Lama ever was. They love Tibetans also. Love to talk about Tibetans are also mysterious. Back to quotes. This university, probably meaning Azhar, lavishly endowed and possessing the best of manuscripts and scientific instruments available, received a grant of 250,000 gold pieces annually from the Imam. Its external form was similar to the pattern of ancient Arab universities. There were no ancient Arab universities, so I don't know what he's talking about. Not much different from Oxford. Oxford, of course, you know, that's the sine qua non of all schools. He wrote this in England. Back to the quotes. But its real purpose was the complete transformation of the mind of the student. Never mind the heart, but the mind of the student. So you see, there's a mixture of truth and fiction. Quote again. Students had to pass through 9 degrees of initiation. Partially true. In the first, the teachers threw their pupils into a state of doubt about all the conventional ideas, religious and political. They used false analogy and every other kind of divisive argument to make the seeker or the aspirant believe that whatever he had been taught by, or she, I suppose, by his previous mentors was prejudiced and capable of being challenged. So the first thing they do, they set up doubt in your mind. Quote, the effect of this, according to the Arab historian Makrizi, was to cause the seeker to lean upon the personality of the teacher as the only possible source of the proper interpretation of facts, because now you no longer know what's right and what's wrong. Quote again, at the same time the teachers continually hinted that formal knowledge was but a cloak for a hidden, inner, and powerful truth whose secret would be imparted when the student was ready to receive it. This keeps you hooked. This confusion technique, in his quotes, was carried out until the student reached the stage where he was prepared to swear a vow of blind allegiance, yani bay'ah, to one or other of his teachers. This oath, another name for bay'ah, together with certain secret signs, they like secret signs, was administered in due course, and the candidate was awarded the first degree of initiation, like the graduation that's going on over there now at the university. The second degree took the form of initiation. This must be their master's degree. The second degree took the form of initiation into the fact that the Imams, the successors of Muhammad, were the only true sources of secret knowledge and power. The Imams are the ones who inspired the teachers. Therefore, the student had to acknowledge every saying and every act of his appointed guides as blessed and divinely inspired. And in the third degree, the esoteric names of the 7 Imams were revealed, and the secret words by which they could be conjured, and by which the powers inherent in the very repetition of their names could be liberated and used for the individual, especially in the service of the sect. In the fourth degree, still in quotes, the succession of the 7 mystical lawgivers and magical personalities was given to the learner. These were Adam, Noah, Ibrahim, Moses, Jesus, Muhammad, and Ismail. There were 7 mystical helpers. He calls them helpers in quote. Set, for Adam, Shem from Noah, Ismail for Ibrahim, Harun for Musa, Simon Peter for Isa, Ali for Muhammad, and Muhammad the son of Ismail for Ismail. The last named was dead, but he had a mysterious deputy, like mysterious deputy. He didn't say just a deputy, but a mysterious deputy, who was the Lord of time, who was authorized to give his instructions to the people of truth, al-Haq, as the Ismailis called themselves. This hidden figure gave the Khalif or the Imam the power to pretend that he was acting under even higher instructions. And in the 5th degree, namely named 12 apostles under the 7 prophets, whose names and functions and magical powers were described. And in this degree, the power to influence others by means of personal concentration was taught. One writer claims that this was done merely by the repetition over a period of 3 years to train the mind by the magical word ak-zabt-I, AK-ZAPT-I. Concentrate on that for 3 years. Bismillah. And you'll know the truth. Quote again, to obtain the 6th degree involved instruction in the methods of analytical and destructive argument in which the postulant or the seeker had to pass a stiff examination. And the 7th degree brought revelation of the great secret, in capital letters, that all humanity and all creation were one, and every single thing was part of the whole, which included the creative and destructive powers. But, as an Ismaili, the individual could make use of the power. It reminds me of a friend of mine who studied Buddhism. I thought he was very sincere. He was a very rich man, but he was studying Buddhism. And I thought, wow, that's really something. And then, so I asked him one time, why are you studying? And he said, to get powers. That was his idea. I was taken in by him. I thought he was trying to achieve enlightenment, but all he was trying to get was powers. So anyway, back to the quotes. But as an Ismaili, the individual could make use of the power which is ready to be awakened inside of him and overcome those who knew nothing of the immense potential of the rest of humanity. And this power came through the aid of a mysterious power called the Lord of the Time. To qualify for the 8th degree, quotes again, the aspirant had to believe that all religion, all philosophy, and all of the like, they're all fraudulent. All that matters is you, the individual, who could attain fulfillment only through servitude to the greatest developed power, who was, quote, the Imam. The 9th and last degree brought the revelation of the secret that there was no such thing as belief. The only thing that mattered was action, amal yani, and the only possessor of the reasons for carrying out any actions was the Imam. Continuing quotes, as a secret society, the organization of the Ismailis, as outlined above, was powerful and seemed likely to produce a large number of devotees who would blindly obey the orders of whomever was in control of the edifice. But as with other bodies of this kind, there were severe limitations from the point of view of effectiveness. Quote again, it is all quotes. Perhaps the phase of revolt or subversion planned by that society did not in the end get underway. Perhaps it was not intended to work by any other means than training the individual. Be that as it may, its real success extended abroad only in 1058 to Baghdad. Well, if you remember the other thing in Nasr Khusro, we have in Nasr Khusro we have this map in here, somewhere in here. Yeah, there's a picture here. It's a map. You can see the green, right? This was in the time of the early Fatimids, where they controlled all the way from North Africa to Mecca and Medina, to Damascus, to Cairo, to Sudan. All of that was controlled. And so it's not something that was going to happen. It was something that had already happened. But in any case, The truth suffers in all of these things. Huh? So they said that real success extended only abroad, only until 1058 to Baghdad, where one member gained temporary control of Baghdad and coined money in the name of the Egyptian imam. But this sultan was slain by the Turks, who now entered the picture, and the Cairo headquarters was also threatened. This is referring to the Ayyubids. And by 1123, the society was closed down by the Wazir Afdal, and the rise of Turkish power seems to have discouraged the expansionist Cairo sect so strongly that they almost faded out, and hardly anything is ever heard of them after that date. He was left to Hassan, son of Sabah, the old man of the mountains. That was one of his titles, to perfect the system of the ailing secret society and found an organization which endured for nearly another 1,000 years. Who was this Hassan? This is quotes again. He was the son of a Shia from Khorasan, a most bigoted man who claimed that his ancestors were Arabs from Kufa. And this assumption was probably due to the fact that such a lineage bolstered his claims to religious importance then as now, which is true, among Muslims, whoever they are. The people of the neighborhood, many of them also Shia, stated very decisively that this Ali was a Persian, and so were his forebears. How that could be, I don't know. It is generally thought that this is the truer version. Ali was actually a Persian, and his forebears were too, which means that, of course, Muhammad was a Persian. Well, that's hard to understand. As the governor of the province was an Orthodox Muslim, I guess they mean a Sunni by that, Ali spared no efforts to assume the same disguise. And he is considered to be completely permissibly adopted this, quote, doctrine of intelligent dissimulation. As there was some doubt as to his reliability in the religious sense, he retired into a monastic retreat. Now the story gets really. And he sent his son Hassan to an Orthodox school. But this school was no ordinary one. You can imagine this is a person who's written a book called The Sufis, and who a whole generation of people, my generation of people, in the 1950s and 60s, this is all we knew about Sufism, what we read in this book. This school was no ordinary one. It was a circle of disciples that was presided over by the redoubtable Imam Muwafiq, who I've never heard of, about whom it was said that every individual enrolled under him eventually rose to great power. It was here that Hassan met Omar Khayyam, the tent-maker poet and astronomer, who was later to be the poet laureate of Persia. And another of his schoolmates was Nizam ul-Mulk, who rose from peasanthood to become the prime minister. And these three made a pact, according to the Nizam's autobiography, that whoever rose to high office first would help the others. Nizam, the courtier, became the vizier to Alp Arslan, the Turkish sultan of Persia, and in accord with his vow, secured for Omar Khayyam a pension, which gave him a life of ease and indulgent in his beloved Nishapur, where many of his Rubaiyat poems were written. In the meantime, Hassan remained in security and obscurity, wandering throughout the Middle East, waiting for his chance to attain the power of which he had dreamed. Arslan the Lion died and was succeeded by Malik Shah, and suddenly Hassan presented himself to Nizam, and he demanded to be given a place at the court. And delighted to fulfill his childhood vow, the vizier obtained him a favored place, and relates what transpired to him in this way in his autobiography. All of this is quotes. Quote, and a quote inside the quote. I made him a minister by my strong and extravagant recommendations, but, like his father, he was a fraud, hypocrite, self-seeking villain. He was so clever at dissimulation that he appeared to be very pious, but he was not. And before long, he had somehow completely captured the mind of the Shah. Malik Shah, the ruler, was young, and Hassan had been trained in the Shi'i art of winning people over by apparent honesty. But the Nizam was still the most intelligent man in the realm, the Vizier, and with an impressive record of honest dealing and achievements. So Hassan decided to get rid of him, eliminate him, is the word he uses. Quote, the king had asked in the year 1078 for a complete accounting of the revenue and the expenditure of the empire, and the Nizam told him that this could take over a year. But Hassan, on the other hand, said no, it could be done in 40 days, and he offered to prove it. And the task was assigned to him, and the accounts were prepared in the specified time, 40 days. But something went wrong at this point. The balance of historical opinion holds that the Nizam struck back at the last moment, saying, Wallahi, this man will destroy us all unless he's rendered harmless, even though I cannot kill my classmate. Well, whatever the truth may be, it seems that Nizam managed to have some disparities introduced into the final calligraphic version of the accounts, so that when Hassan started to read them, they appeared so absurd that the Shah, in fury, ordered him to be exiled. As he had claimed to have written the accounts in his own hand, Hassan could not justify these incredible disparities. Hassan had some friends in Isfahan, where he immediately fled, and there survives a record of what was said there, which sheds interesting light upon what was in mind. One of his friends, Abu Fadl, notes that Hassan, after reciting the bitter tale of his downfall, shouted these words in a state of rage, if I had just two devotees who would stand by me, I would cause the downfall of that Turk and that peasant. Abu Fadl, concluded that Hassan had taken leave of his senses and tried to get him out of this ugly mood, but Hassan took umbrage and insisted that he was working on a plan and he would have his revenge, and he set off immediately to Egypt to mature his plans. Abu Fadl himself was later to become a devotee of Hassan. 2 decades later, Hassan reminded him of that day in Isfahan. He says, here I am at Alamut. I am now the master of all I survey and more. The Sultan and the peasant Wazir are dead. Have I not kept my vow? Was I the madman you thought me to be? I found my 2 devotees who were necessary to my plans. Hassan himself takes up the story, all in quotes, takes up the story of how his fortunes fared after his flight from Persia. He had been brought up in the secret doctrines of Ismailism and recognized the possibilities of power inherent in such a system. He knew that in Cairo there was a powerful nucleus of the society, and if we are to believe the words of Abu Fadl, he already had a plan whereby he would turn their followers into a disciplined, devoted fanatics willing to die for their leader. What was that plan? He decided it was not enough to promise people paradise. It's not enough to promise people fulfillment and eternal joy, but he would actually show it to them. He'd show it to them in the form of an artificial paradise where houris played and fountains gushed sweet-scented waters, where every sensual wish was granted amid beautiful flowers and gilded pavilions. And this is what he did. Eventually, Hassan chose a hidden valley for the site of his paradise, described by Marco Polo. Another fantasy, by the way, because he never even visited there, but he wrote about it, who passed 200 miles to the west, to the east, in 1271. Quote Marco Polo now. In the beautiful valley enclosed between 2 lofty mountains, he made a luxurious garden stored with every delicious fruit and every fragrant shrub that could be produced. Palaces of various sizes and forms were erected in different parts of the grounds. This is the picture of where this place is. It's a very barren, and here's another picture of the place where it is. It's not exactly what you would call a beautiful valley. enclosed between two lofty mountains. In any case, palaces of various sizes and forms were erected in different parts of the grounds, ornamented with works of gold, with paintings, with furniture of rich silks, and by means of small conduits contained inside these buildings, streams of wine and milk and honey and pure water were seen to flow in every direction. The inhabitants of these places were elegant and beautiful women, accomplished in the arts of singing and playing upon all sorts of musical instruments, dancing, and especially those of dalliance and amorous allurement. Clothed in rich dresses, they were seen continually sporting and amusing themselves in the gardens and the pavilions, their female guardians being confined within doors and never allowed to appear. The object which the chief had in forming a garden, this is Marco Polo, of this fascinating kind was this, that Mohammed, M-A-H-O-M-E-T, Mahomet, having promised to those who should obey his will the enjoyments of paradise, where every species of sensual and sexual gratification should be found in the society of beautiful nymphs, he was desirous of it being understood by his followers that he also was a prophet, and he was the compeer of Muhammad, and he had the power of admitting to paradise whoever he chose to favor. And in order that none without his license should find their way into this delicious valley, he caused a strong and expugnable castle to be erected at the opening of the valley, through which the entry was by a secret passage. There are numerous pictures of this, no doubt, people have painted over the years. And Hassan now began to attract young men from the surrounding countryside between the ages of 12 and 20, particularly those he'd marked out as possible material for the creation of killers. Every day he held court, a reception in which he spoke of the delights of paradise, and at certain times he caused draughts of soporific nature to be administered to 10 or 12 youths, and when they were half dead with sleep, he had them carried and conveyed to these several palaces and apartments of the garden, and upon wakening from their state of lethargy, their drugged state, their senses were struck by all the delightful objects, and each perceiving himself surrounded by lovely women, singing, playing, and attracting his regards by the most fascinating caresses, serving him with delicious viands and exquisite wines, until intoxicated with excess and enjoyment, amidst actual rivers of milk and wine, he believed himself assuredly in paradise, and he felt an unwillingness to relinquish its delights. And then, when 4 or 5 days had been passed, they were thrown once more into a state of somnolency, carried out of the garden, and upon being carried into his presence and questioned by him as to where they had been, they said, "We were in paradise, through the favor of your highness." And then, before the whole court, who listened to them with eager astonishment and curiosity, they gave an account of the scenes to which they had been witness. The chief, thereupon addressing them, said, "We have the assurance of our prophet that whoever defends his leader shall inherit paradise. And if you show yourself to be devoted to the obedience of my orders, that happy lot awaits you." Well, suicide was at first attempted by some, but the survivors were told that only death in the obedience to Hassan's orders could give them the key to paradise. In the 11th century, it was not only credulous Persian peasants who would have believed such things were true. Even among more sophisticated people, the reality of the gardens, the houris of paradise, was completely accepted. True, a good many Sufis preached that the garden was allegorical, but that still left more than a few people who believed they could trust the evidence of their senses. The Ancient Art of Imposture, a book by Abdul Rahman of Damascus, gives away another trick of Hassan's. He had a deep, narrow pit sunk into the floor of his audience chamber, and one of his disciples stood in this pit. in such a way that only his head and neck were visible above the floor. Then he placed a circular dish, which came in two pieces that fitted together exactly, with a hole in the middle. This gave the impression that there was a severed head on a metal plate standing on the floor, and in order to make the scene more plausible, this is all in quotes, if that is the word, Hassan had some fresh blood poured around the head on the plate. Now, certain of the recruits were brought in, and Hassan spoke to the head and said, "Tell them what you have seen." And this disciple described the delights of paradise. And he told him, "Now, you've seen the head of a man who died, whom you all knew, and I have reanimated him to speak with his own tongue." Amazing, a dead head speaking, dead heads, weren't there? Later, the head was treacherously severed in earnest and stuck up for some time so the faithful would see it. And the effect of this conjuring trick plus murder increased the enthusiasm for martyrdom to the required degree. And there are many documented instances, of course he doesn't give you any of these, of the recklessness of the Fidayeen, the devotees of the Ismailis, one being a witness being a Westerner who was treated a century later to a similar spectacle to that which had appalled the envoy of Malik Shah. Henry, Count of Champagne, reports that he was traveling in 1194 through Ismaili territory, and the chief sent some persons to salute him and begged that on his return he should stop and partake of the hospitality of the castle. And the Count accepted the invitation, and as he returned to the Da'i al-Kabir, the great missionary advanced to meet him and showed him every mark of honor, and let him view his castle and the fortresses. And having passed through several of these, they came at length to one of the towers, which rose to an exceeding height, and in each tower stood, this is the original thing, the sentinels clad in white. "These," said the chief, pointing to them, "obey me more than the subjects of Christians obey their lords. And as it is given signal, two of them will fling themselves down." And they did, and were dashed to pieces. "If you wish," he said to the astonished Count, "all of my white ones shall do the same." And the benevolent Count shrank from the proposal, and candidly said that no Christian prince could presume to look for such obedience from his subjects. When he was departing with many valuable presents, the chief said to him, "By means of these trusty servants, I get rid of the enemies of our society." Still quote, "Further details of the mentality of Hassan were given in what is supposed to be an autobiographical account of his early days, and is probable as such a fact because the method of his conversion does seem to follow the pattern which is observed in fanatics of whatever religious or political persuasion. He was, he says, reared in the belief of the divine right of the Imams by his father, and he met early on an Ismaili missionary, Emir Dahrab, with whom he argued strenuously against the Emir's particular form of creed." In other words, he didn't believe in these Ismailis. But then, sometime later, he went through a bout of severe illness in which he thought he'd die, and he began to think about the Ismaili doctrine. It might really be the road to redemption and paradise, and if he died unconverted, he might be damned. And thus was that, as soon as he recovered, he sought out another Ismaili propagandist, Abu Najm, and then others, and eventually he went to Egypt to study the teaching of Dawah at its center in Cairo. He received with honor by the Caliph, the Imam, due to his former position at the court of Malik Shah, and in order to increase their own importance, the high officials of the court made a great deal of his public play of the significance of the new convert. But this fact seemed in the end to help Hassan more than it did them. He entered into political intrigue, and he was arrested, and then he was confined in the fortress. And no sooner that he had entered the prison than a minaret collapsed, and in some unexplained way this was interpreted as an omen that Hassan was in reality a divinely protected person. And the Caliph hurriedly made Hassan a number of valuable gifts and put him aboard a ship sailing for northwest Africa. So this gave him now the funds which he was going to use to set up his paradise, and also, through some quirk of fate, the disciples whom he sought. A tremendous storm came up, terrifying the captain, the crew, and the passengers. Prayers were held. Hassan was asked to join, but refused. He said, "This storm is my doing. How can I pray that it abate?" He asked, I have indicated the displeasure of the Almighty. If we sink, I shall not die, for I am immortal. If you want to be saved, believe in me, and I'll subdue the winds. At first the offer was not accepted, but presently, however, when the ship seemed to be on the point of capsizing, the desperate passengers came to him and swore eternal allegiance. Hassan remained calm and continued to do so until finally the storm died down. And the ship was then driven on to the coast of Syria instead of to the west, where Hassan went ashore together with two of the passengers who became his first disciples. Hassan was not ready yet for the fulfillment of his destiny as he saw it. For the time being he was traveling under the guise of a missionary of the Imam in Cairo, and from Aleppo he went to Baghdad, seeking a headquarters where he would be safe from interference and where he would yet be powerful enough to expand. The road instead led him deep into Persia. Traveling through the country he made converts to his ideas, which still apparently were strongly based upon the secret doctrines of the Egyptian Ismailis. Everywhere he created a devoted disciple, who we called a Fidai, and he bade him stay and tried to enlarge the circle of his followers. And these circles became hatching grounds for the production of self-sacrificers, the initiates who were drawn from the ranks of the most promising ordinary converts. And thus it was that miniature training centers, modeled after the Dar al-Hikmah, the abode of learning, were set into being within a very few months of his return to his homeland. And during his travels, a trusted lieutenant, one Hussein Khahini, reported that the Iraqi district where the fortress of Alamut, this is Persian Iraq, it's different, it's Iraq but it's in Persia, where the fortress of Alamut was situated, seemed to be an ideal place for proselytism. Most of the ordinary people of that place were already Ismailis. The only obstacle was the government, Ali Mahdi, who looked upon the Khalif of Baghdad as his spiritual and temporal lord. The first converts were expelled from the country, but before many months, however, there were so many Ismailis among the populace that the governor was compelled to allow them to return. And Hassan, though he would not brook, he says he is not allowed. But the prospector of Alamut decided to try a trick. He offered the governor 3,000 pieces of gold for the amount of land which could be encompassed by the hide of an ox. Well, the Mahdi agreed to such a sale, and Hassan produced a skin, and he cut it into the thinnest possible thongs, and he joined them all together to form a string which encompassed the fortress of Alamut. And although the governor refused to honor this bargain, Hassan produced an order from a very highly placed official in the Seljuk rulers, ordering that the fortress be handed over to Hassan for 3,000 pieces of gold. And it turned out that this official was himself a secret follower of the Sheikh of the Mountain. This was in the year 1090, and Hassan was ready for the next part of his plan. He attacked and routed the forces of the emir, who had placed in the governorship of the province, and he subsequently welded the people of the surrounding districts into a firm band of diligent and trustworthy workers and soldiers answerable to him alone. And within 2 years, the wazir, Nizam al-Mulk, he had him stabbed to the heart by an assassin sent by him. And the emperor, Malik Shah, who dared to send troops against him, died in grave suspicion of poison. Hassan's revenge upon his classmate was to make him the very first target for his reign of terror. And when the king's death, the whole realm was split up into warring factions. For a time, the assassins alone attained their cohesion. In under a decade, they had made themselves master of all of Persian Iraq and of many forts throughout the empire. And they did this by forays, direct attacks, poisoned daggers, any other manner which seemed expedient. And the orthodox religious leaders pronounced one interdiction after another against these doctrines, and all were to no effect. By now, the entire loyalty of the Ismailis under him had been transferred from the Caliph to the personality of the Sheikh of the Mountain, who became the terror of every prince in that part of Asia, the Crusader chiefs included. Despite and despising fatigues, dangers, and tortures, the assassins joyfully gave their lives whenever it pleased the great master, who required them either to protect himself or to carry out his mandates of killing and death. And the victim having been pointed out, the faithful clothed in a white tunic with a red sash, the colors of innocence and blood, went on their mission without being deterred by distance or danger, and having found the person they sought, they awaited the favorable moment for the slaying, and their daggers seldom missed their aim. Richard the Lion-Hearted was at one time accused of having asked the Lord of the Mountains to have Conrad of Montferrat killed, a plot that was carried out thus. 2 assassins allowed themselves to be baptized and placed themselves beside him, seeming intent only on praying. When the favorable opportunity presented himself, they stabbed him, and one took refuge in the church. But hearing that the prince had been carried off still alive, he forced himself again into Montferrat's presence and stabbed him a second time, and then expired without a complaint amidst refined tortures. The order of the assassins had perfected their method of securing the loyalty of human beings to an extent and on a scale seldom paralleled. The assassins carried out the battle on 2 fronts. They fought whichever side in the crusade served their purposes. At the same time, they continued their struggle against the Persians, and the son and successor of Nizam al-Mulk was laid low by an assassin's dagger. The Sultan who succeeded his father Malik Shah and gained power over most of the territories was marching against him. And one morning, he woke up with an assassin's knife stuck neatly into the ground right next to his head. Underneath was a note warning him to call off his siege. He came to terms with the assassins, powerful ruler though he was. They had what amounted to a free hand in exchange for a pact which promised to reduce their military power. And Hassan lived on for 34 years after his acquisition of Alamut, and only on 2 occasions did he ever leave his rooms. Yet he ruled an invisible empire as great and fearsome as any man before or since. And he seemed to realize that death was almost upon him, and calmly he began to make plans for the perpetual continuance of the order of the assassins. End quote. Everything I read to you has been quote of Idris Shah, writing under this name of Arkan Darul. And this is how Hassan was portrayed to the people. So you see, this is quite a story. So this, you imagine hearing this story, this would give you to think how this man was. This is how people thought he was. Plus Marco Polo, also writing. Here's another one. Can you take another one? Ready for another one?
Go ahead.
This is another lurid example. He's asleep. Ahmed? Yes, you missed extraordinary tales, Ahmed. Here's another example of how you didn't have sleep last night. How Hassan Sabah and the secret order of the Hashashins was portrayed in an essay under that title published online in the online blog called Disinformation, March 22nd, 2001. The story of Hassan Sabah, quote, now, is a tale of sex, drugs, myth, and murder. That'll get you. Boy, you read that, you got to read the whole story, right? I mean, that's a winner right from the start, right? You can't beat that, right? Sex, drugs, and murder. Wow. So here's the story. This is a secluded mountain fortress, a paradisical garden, poison-dipped daggers, and covert political maneuverings are the ingredients of this alchemical mixture, which is undoubtedly one of the most intriguing true stories ever told. Hassan Sabah, businessman, scholar, heresiarch, mystic, murderer, ascetic, political revolutionary, was born in Persia, Iran, around 1034. As a child, the man who would one day claim to be an incarnation of God on earth, probably just another way of saying he was enlightened, was a diligent student of theology. And supposedly, this is all in quotes, Hassan was schoolmates with Nizam al-Mulk, the future wazir to the Sultan of Persia, and Umar Khayyam, the great poet, astronomer, and mathematician. By the way, this story appears in numerous places. These three future luminaries made a pact where if any one of them reached a position of power and influence, he would assist his companions. As a young man, Hassan traveled to Egypt, where he remained for a year and a half. Here he was taught at the illustrious abode of learning. Again, we're back to Dar al-Hikmah in Cairo, which was a Shia training center. And then there's in brackets, he says, the Shia are a branch within the Islamic community that broke off from the mainstream Sunnis after a dispute as who should succeed the Prophet Muhammad, end bracket. At the abode, quotes, at the abode, students were taught to question. Now this in both stories, this is to understand how it works. They're taught to question Islamic dogma to the point where their only source of the truth, again agreeing in the stories, lay in the teachings of their all-powerful teachers. The students had to ascend through 9 degrees, same story, until finally they were taught the ultimate truth, that this world is created by action. Beliefs are powerless distractions. They're only used to enslave the masses. This system would later serve as the model for the organizational structure of the Hashishins. Hassan ran into trouble in Egypt, however, after a controversy arose over who should succeed the Fatimid Caliph who died. And the Fatimids who ruled Egypt at that time were heads of the Ismailis, a sect of Islam that separated from mainstream Shia. And before the Fatimid Caliph died, he appointed his youngest son to take over the dynasty because his oldest son died before he did. This infuriated Sabah, who believed that the descendant of the Caliph's oldest son, his son Nizar, was the rightful heir to the throne. This is why they're called Nizaris. Sabah, quotes again, Sabah was imprisoned in Egypt for supporting Nizar, but as luck would have it, a prison wall collapsed and he fled to Persia. And while searching for a permanent residence, Hassan found a secluded fortress high in the mountains of Qazvin. And this castle, called Alamut, the eagle's nest, was the ideal stronghold for Hassan's new sect of the Nizari Ismailites. And Alamut was positioned in a central location, and so was an excellent hub from which Hassan could spread his propaganda. Hassan went about securing Alamut using subtle trickery, same story again, and persuasion. While bargaining with the owner of Alamut, he requested only a portion of the land that could be covered by the skin of a cow. The owner agreed, not realizing how clever and resourceful Hassan could be, and he divided up the cow's hide into such thin layers that he was able to cover the entire surface area of the fortress. And the owner was forced to live up to his end of the bargain, and Hassan now had a stronghold from which he could extend his influence throughout the Mideast and indeed the history of Western civilization. So you see in these stories there are certain things that there are in common, and you have to pay a lot of attention to these things because you have to see where these things agree, and you know that there's something that's going on in them. Anyway, continuing the quotes, when word reached Nizam al-Mulk that a friend of Hassan's had secured Alamut, he became inflamed with jealousy and rage, and he sent an army to lay siege to the fortress, but the plot failed miserably. And for this, Hassan had his schoolmate Nizam killed by a dagger straight to the heart. So much for his pact. Within Alamut, Hassan built the legendary Garden of Earthly Delights, which would play an important role in the initiatic rites of the Hashishins. The garden lay, again, the same story, similar story, in a beautiful valley. Here he had imported exotic plants, birds, and animals from all over the world, and surrounding the garden were luxurious palaces of marble and gold, decorated with beautiful paintings, fine silk furniture. Streams of milk and wine and honey flowed through this earthly paradise. Fountains gushed with wine and pure spring water. And the initiate, after having been knocked out by a powerful potion mixed with hashish, would be carried into the garden, and when he woke from his slumber, he would be greeted by a host of beautiful teenage virgins, Huria, and who sang and danced and played lovely instruments for him. And as he drifted into an ecstatic daze, the girls would go to work on the initiate. I've cut out certain portions here. No wonder Hassan could demand absolute loyalty from his followers, no questions asked. This was only a small part of his system, which is divided into 7 degrees. The other was 9. This is 7. The Hashishins combine both the exoteric, that's God's communicated law or the Sharia, and esoteric, subjective mystical doctrines of Islam. Sabah was a noted alchemist in the study of Sufism, a student of Sufism. So part of the initiatic curriculum for these future Hashishins involved mastering occult methods for reaching higher planes of consciousness. And of course they were told and taught how to properly kill a human being using poison or a dagger. And they were trained to learn multiple languages as well as to dress in the manner of merchants and beggars and monks and priests and soldiers. And they were taught to fake beliefs and devotion to every major religion in that era. And in this way, an assassin could pretend to be anybody, from a well-to-do merchant to a Sufi mystic to a Christian or a common soldier. This Hashishin order was set up much like any traditional bureaucratic organization. At the top of the hierarchy was Hassan, the old man of the mountains, who preached absolute devotion to a transcendental God, and below him were the grand priories, enlightened mystics and propagandists and fidais, and the lowest ranking, the Hishashin. And these fidais were self-sacrificers, suicide bombers, anybody? Called the destroying angels, who were willing to commit any atrocity their master demanded of them, including suicide. They dressed in white tunics with red sashes, it agrees, colors that represented innocence and blood. And as these Hashishin gained power and influence, the Sultan of Persia grew agitated, and he sent his troops to storm Alamut, which, like the similar attack which was attempted by his wazir, was a pathetic failure. And Hassan had the Sultan poisoned, and after his death the kingdom of Persia split into warring factions, which made the assassins the most cohesive and powerful group in Persia for many years. And during this time the assassins turned murder into an art form, mastering the fatal uses of the dagger, which they dipped into poison. But these were intellectuals, not mindless murderous brutes by any means. So their favorite means of extending influence was through spreading propaganda. And they would often gain support from powerfully positioned women by impressing them with fantastic dresses and jewels. And also they were known to kidnap some of the most distinguished minds of the Mideast and use them as teachers in their school or as advisors in worldly affairs. It didn't take long before most of Persia was Ismaili. As for the man who was responsible for this madness, Hassan Sabah, he was something of a mystery. After securing Alamut, he lived the remainder of his life holed up in his room, same story. It is said that he left his living quarters only twice in this period. All the stories the same. He was an ascetic, a mystic. He wrote a number of important theological treatises. This might seem counterintuitive, but the reason Hassan was so ambitious and he resorted to such extreme measures is because he was a deeply involved and devoted believer in the Ismaili faith, not because of selfish greed or megalomania. In fact, Hassan himself may well have been a direct descendant of the Imam genealogy, but he refused to use this, a member of Ahlul Bayt. He refused to use this to his advantage, saying, "I would rather be the Imam's chosen servant than his unworthy son. Let's give you some idea. Within Alamut, convivialities like drinking and playing musical instruments were strictly forbidden. This was, now we're getting a different story. This was a vacuum-tight operation. This sounds like a, government operative here. This was a vacuum-tight operation, and Hassan demanded unwavering attention and devotion from his followers. He was so severe, and this is true, in fact, that he had his only two sons executed, one for drinking and the other one for committing a senseless murder. He died in 1124 at the age of 90. Having killed his only two potential heirs, he appointed two of his generals to succeed him. One took over the mystical elements of the order, and the other took over the military and political affairs. And during this time, the Seljuk dynasty again took control in Persia, and this new sultan made a pact with the assassins, whereby the assassins were given autonomy in exchange for reducing their military forces. These Hashishin persisted for over 100 years after Sabah's death. But Alamut was finally laid siege to and conquered in 1256 by Hulagu Khan, son of Genghis Khan. A man, and this is a very important man, you have to remember his name was called Juwayni, was ordered to write a complete history of the assassins after Hulagu had paid him to burn down. He had pretended to be an Ismaili. He actually lived there. He paid this man Juwayni. Is what you call, a trader. He paid this man Juwayni to write a complete history of the assassins. So the only history we really have is based on this Juwayni, who based it upon the records he found in the Alamut library, which he then destroyed, which is where most of the historical document about the order comes from. So how can you trust it? This is where it comes from. So some of the people have questioned the historical validity of the assassins' hashish use. It is stated clearly as a fact in this carefully researched history. Also in this book it is written that the assassins did not eat hashish to relax themselves before going out on murderous rampage, as is popularly believed, but rather would consume the drug before going into the garden for one last time for a week prior to their suicide mission. After the fall of Alamut, most of the remaining assassins were forced underground, where they would wait a word and so on and so forth, and like this, where they would wait a word that the order was back in business. And to this day, there is a branch of the Nizari Ismailis, who, by the way, dropped the title in the 1800s in Afghanistan of Hashishins. They still persist, and they are led by a man called Aga Khan, whose progressive globalist rhetoric sounds very similar to the utopian world view of Buckminster Fuller. The secret order, because if you read his things or listen to his talks, that's what he sounds like. The secret order that Hassan Sabah created had a significant impact on all subsequent cults and secret societies. During the Crusades, the Hashishin fought for and against the Crusaders, whatever suited them. And as a result, the Crusaders brought back to Europe this system, which would be passed down: the Knights Templar, the Society of Jesus, the Jesuits, the Prieuré de Sion, the Freemasons, the Rosicrucians. All of them, in fact, owe their organization efficiency to Hassan. This is still in this article. In fact, the Illuminati, who people talk about and write about, and everybody's very interested, had their origins in the mystical aspect of the Hashishin and so forth. So he should serve as the ideal archetype for future revolutionaries. As money becomes the soul, and not to mention spectral representation of powers. Last week a man gave this talk and he says, it's not tanks anymore, it's banks. That's what controls things. Banks, not tanks. Echoing this thing. Governments gradually decline in effectiveness, and the invisible hand becomes the force pushing us along. And secret societies like these people, self-protected and pursuing its own agendas, thrive in our present environment. We can see this is true. Okay, that's what this is. This is in there, this thing called disinformation that came out on the web. You search the web, you'll find a lot of stuff about it. But now let's take another person, Bernard Lewis. People have heard of Bernard Lewis. He's a very well-known Orientalist, British-American professor of history at Princeton University. So you think, well, now we'll get something objective. This is Princeton University talking. Who traces the history of the secret Islamic sect known as the Assassins, an order of Ismailis that used assassination throughout the Middle Ages to achieve political, military, and religious goals from then till Islamic terrorism in the present. His take, this is me writing, his take is less lurid and more political, benefiting historian who has been called, quote, perhaps the most articulate, listen, the most articulate and learned Zionist advocate in the North American Middle East academic community. So that's who this is coming from, right? Got to know where is this coming from. The man who is considered to be the most articulate and learned Zionist advocate in the North American Middle East academic community. A review of his newly reissued book, The Assassins, this review is by a man by the name of Kevin Rushby in The Guardian. It's a bit more low-key. Quote, now, we're quoting the review by this man, Kevin Rushby. They have, quote, they have among them a master who strikes the greatest fear into all Saracen princes, the Saracens. Saracen princes both far and near as well as the neighboring Christian lords. He has the habit of killing them in an astonishing way. The prince gives each of his followers a golden dagger and sends him out to kill whichever prince he has marked down for death. This is a quote from this man. And for this service, the master promises them, quotes, the joys of paradise. This is from Lewis. Now again from him. So it was that Christendom first heard in 1175 of the old man of the mountains. They love that, the old man of the mountains, and his murderous sect of assassins. Several notable killings had preceded this nose, and more were to follow, but a century later the group disintegrated and the old man's followers went back to becoming peasant farmers. What did survive, however, was the image of devoted killers, dagger in one hand and the passport to paradise in the other. It is an imagery that Osama bin Laden has deployed, but how much, one wonders, does he know of this heritage, and has it influenced his thinking? Now back to the reviewer. Such questions make Bernard Lewis's newly reissued classic, The Assassins, first published in 1967, a fascinating read. The book offers a tempting opportunity to stroll in the pleasure gardens of historical parallels, gardens that are thickly planted naturally with fiendish booby traps. Now back to Bernard Lewis. The forces of mysticism, passion, and violence have always been a volatile combination, inspiring murderous sects throughout history. The Kali-worshipping Indian Thuggee, who struggled an estimated 1 million souls before Captain William Sleeman stopped them in the 1830s. His account of how it was done ought to be a compulsory reading for anti-terrorism agents, but is also open to doubt. The origins of that cult are unknown, but there is evidence that they lay in an 8th century Persia. It was there in 1090. How that becomes the 8th century, I don't know. That a missionary by the name of Hassan Sabah set up shop in a castle called Alamut, a remote stronghold in the mountains of the South Caspian Sea. Quote again from Bernard Lewis. Son of a Yemeni immigrant to Persia. Osama bin Laden was the son of a Yemeni immigrant to Saudi Arabia, right? Son of a Yemeni immigrant to Persia, Hassan has become an Ismaili and as such a heretic from an oppressed minority. His contribution was to marry the mystical and violent impulses of his followers to the politics of anguish and frustration. Legend has it that recruits were softened up with ideology, then drugged and transported into a wonderful palace garden. One example of the word assassin is that it derives from the Arabic hashish. So now he's instituting this. Waking to find themselves surrounded by beautiful women, wine, and song, the thoroughly fuddled youth concluded they were in paradise. Alas, the idyll did not last. Drugged again, they found themselves before the old man, who confirmed that they had indeed visited the heavenly abode promised to them by the Koran. That's Koran. They love to spell it that way, Koran. And he offered them a return route via murder. Well, now we're back to the reviewer. The truth is hidden somewhere inside such legends, and Professor Lewis is a dependable guide to the historical informants, all of whom have an axe to grind, even if not all wish subsequently to bury that axe between the ears of an appointed victim. In Hassan's time as now, power in the Islamic world was based upon a small and wealthy elite. For Abbasid Caliph in Baghdad read the sons of Ibn Saud. The assassins wanted to destroy this dynasty. In their ferocious attempts, it was usually Muslims who suffered, not the Crusaders, as is often thought. Most victims were Sunnis, and a few were immensely powerful. And the murder of the Grand Vizier Nizam al-Mulk was the 11th century equivalent of toppling the Twin Towers. More than a few crusaders fell to that golden dagger. The Marquis, quote again, the Marquis Conrad of Montferrat, the King of Jerusalem, was one. In a twist worthy of the CIA, Richard the Lionheart was implicated in hiring Muslim assassins. But bin Laden's avowed claim of clearing out crusaders and Jews from holy places was never on the assassin agenda. In the 12th century, one group remained untouched. The old man recognized that the organization of the Knights Hospitaliers made them unassailable by his methods. If one was struck down, another stepped forward. Like Hydra, it was not a beast that could be defeated by headlopping. A lesson for both sides in the current situation. With autocrats and tyrants, such tactics appeared more effective, and yet as the list of murders sanctioned from Alamut lengthened, no such long-term advantages accrued, only a vast stock of hatred and suspicion, as in Afghanistan. Later, when the ruling powers, that's my side quote, later when the ruling powers were stronger, the temptation to send in the medieval equivalent of the F-16s was irresistible. In Persia, the assassins were finished off by the Mongols, in Syria by the Egyptian Mamluks. The assassin campaign was paralleled by a withering of Ismaili influence in philosophy, science, and religion. Tellingly, Lewis says, now quotes from Lewis, under Hassan Sabah and his successors, the Ismailis posed terrible political, military, and social problems to Sunni Islam, but no longer offered an intellectual challenge. More and more, their religion acquired the magical and emotional qualities, redemptionist and millenarian hopes associated with the cults of the dispossessed, the disprivileged, and unstable. Where the assassins, this is again Lewis, where the assassins did succeed was in leaving a poisonous legacy. Here he's telling his story. A legacy so virulent it reaches down the centuries and infects minds as diverse as the children of Gaza, Muslim youths in Britain, and most noticeably of all, the wealthy son of a Yemeni immigrant to Saudi Arabia. That is why, despite occasional lapses, Lewis's book is essential reading for us and no comfort for anyone. So what he's saying is that this whole thing led from then till now, and you see it manifested now in Al-Qaeda and everything like that. This is all one thing. In other words, Hassan Sabah, in some way, is the founder or the inspiration for Al-Qaeda. This is the picture that he paints out. So here you see, this is the disinformation. And as I said, even Marco Polo added to the legend. Bismillah, this is the last thing. On his return home from China, he ventured into a region which he calls Mulet, south of the Caspian Sea, in which the assassin stronghold of Alamut stands. And on his return he claimed in writing, Mulahat, the name given to heretical Saracens, I don't know what Mulahat means, I don't know. Given to heretical Saracens is also the name of the famous place where the old man of the mountains used to live. The story of the old man, just as it was told to Marco Polo by many people, this is a quote from Marco Polo. According to legend, the old man was called Alauddin. He made in a valley between two mountains. Again, you hear the story. The biggest and most beautiful garden imaginable. Every kind of wonderful fruit grew there. There were glorious houses and palaces decorated with gold and painting. Same story. Most magnificent things in the world, fresh water, wine, milk, and honey flowed in the streams. Beautiful girls versed in the arts of caressing and flattering men played every musical instrument, danced and sang better than any other woman. And the old man had persuaded his men this was paradise. And the Prophet Muhammad had taught those that when they went to paradise, they would find beautiful women and rivers of wine and milk and honey and fresh water. And so the old man of the mountains had his garden built like Muhammad's paradise, and the Saracens believed it was paradise. End of quote. Marco Polo goes on to explain how this belief was maintained. Young men were trained for a mission of assassination, were given a sleeping draught, and then taken into the gardens while unconscious, and they awoke up in the ravishing surroundings, naturally persuaded them that they were in paradise, and they remained in this happy state until a victim was designated, where they once more would be drugged and were removed still asleep from the garden. And then they woke up in front of the old man, and they had this certainty then born of experience that paradise existed and would be their reward, because they had seen it and they had lived in it. It's not only to strengthen their determination to succeed in their task, it removed all fear of failure, because knowing what awaited them in the next world, they didn't fear death. The old man won the devotion of his agents both by drugs and by exploiting their simple piety. And despite his taste for colorful detail, Marco Polo was also a realist, and he ends his description of the assassins with his comment, quote, "Many kings and barons paid tribute to the old man and cultivated his friendship for fear of being murdered. The old man was aided in this fact that the kings were always quarreling amongst themselves and were not united." Then there's one more thing. There's a book called Samarkand by a man by the name of Amin Malouf, which is a heavily fictionalized romantic biography and tale of events surrounding the original manuscript of the Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam, which in the end, says the author, unbelievably sank with the Titanic. And he tells the whole story of how this manuscript wound up, hidden in the library in Alamut, smuggled out of there. It's the history of the manuscript of the Rubaiyat, and how finally a man, it was bought by a museum and he's carrying it to America, and he's on board the Titanic, and the Titanic ships sinks with the Rubaiyat on it. Amazing story. Samarkand tells how three influential contemporaries, and again you see parts of the story again, Hassan Sabah, Omar Khayyam, and Nizam Mamluk were originally allies, but Nizam and Hassan differed in religious and political views. In 1092, Nizam was the first victim of the assassins, and so on and so forth. And it even goes on, from there I want to spare you a little bit, but it even goes on to avant-garde or hippie writers or readers of the late 20th century, from William S. Burroughs to Hakim Bey, who's also known as Peter Lamborn Wilson, who also write about Hassan Sabah. And somebody reported this to me before I was beginning, and here's the same thing they were talking about. Maxim, Hassan Sabah. William Burroughs says, Hassan Sabah is the only spiritual leader with anything to say in the space age. I don't know if you know who William Burroughs is, but you can look him up. now from another online thing, Maxim. Nothing is true. Everything is permitted. This was supposedly what he said. Yes, the words of Hassan Sabah. Nothing is true. Everything is permitted. But permitted only for the initiate. Of course, others say the real statement was nothing is haram. All is halal, which makes a statement about Shariat law into the context of esoteric Shia initiation in which the Imam is above the law and is salvific. And this brings me, this is an online, I copied this right offline. This brings me from some blogger. This brings me to a point in the Quran in the Surah Kaf, knowledgeable at least, Surah of the Cave, where the companion of Musa, who repairs the wall, this is back to our original story of Sayyidina Khidr alayhi salam, unjust people, he sinks a boat, kills a boy, much to the chagrin of Moses, the lawgiver. Yet it appears that the mysterious companion, popularly known as Khidr, was actually trying to initiate Moses into the realm of the perfect man, who is apart from the law and not answerable to the deity. So actually Hassan Sabah's teachings are actually preceded by the teachings of Khidr, right? Now he's tracking it back to there, right? And nevertheless, Khidr's outrageous actions, of sinking the boat and killing the people and rebuilding the wall, were not simply whimsical acting out, but based on a deeper intuition of the situation at hand, something which the law and God do not allow for. Now suddenly, Shariat can be overcome, the Zahir can be overcome by the Batin. This is what's happening here. In other words, Khidr is the Batin, Musa is the Shariat, is the Zahir, and the Batin overwhelms the Zahir. Okay? Thus the message is one of freedom, not a freedom to act unjustly, because of course Khidr didn't act unjustly, but a freedom to act in harmony with a higher understanding, right? That's the Batini understanding, to master the moment. Ibn Arabi spoke of the Imam as one's own being, and it is, in other words, that anybody who attains to this enlightenment is the Imam. The Imam is not somebody who's from Al-Bayt and all of these things like that. It's anybody who attains to this level of thought, understanding, is the Imam. He's the Imam of himself. And this is parallel to the Gnosis of Christ. This is what the blogger is writing. That is soteriological and Gnostic in Islam, a thread of which still exists in some pockets of Sufis here and there, along with genuine initiation into the secrets of Al-Insan Al-Kamil, or the perfect man. And then there's Hakim Bey, Peter Lamborn Wilson, who was a scholar who studied with Tabatabai, by the way, and back in the 70s and 60s, and then became known as Hakim Bey. But his name as a scholar was Peter Lamborn Wilson, who is something, and this is now the blogger writing, a modern-day Sabah who has written tracts about the Hashishins, including a section in the classic Temporary Autonomous Zone, which is where you're sitting, where Bey uses the assassins as a model for the types of personalities needed to create and sustain a Taz, that is a temporary autonomous zone, saying, each one who enters the realm of the Imam of one's own being becomes a sultan of inverted revelation, a monarch of abrogation and apostasy. Hassan Sabah should serve as the ideal architect for future revolutionaries. As money, again, talking about money, as money becomes the sole representation of power. Hakim Bey, writing under his real name, provides an excellent history of Hassan and his assassins. This appeared in Scandal, Essays in Islamic Heresy, published by Autonomedia, P.O. Box, they're keen on this, P.O. Box 568, Williamsburg Station, Brooklyn, New York, USA, in case you want to order a copy. And it's copyrighted Peter Lamborn Wilson, a.k.a. Hakim Bey. This is basically, I'm not going to go through this whole thing, and it's basically the same story. It's another take on the same story, with certain things added into it. Because he studied with Tabatabai, of course, he has a much greater understanding of the the real view of things. So I've taken you from the most outrageous, which is the one of Idris Shah, to this. This is a series of things to show you how did this man get this reputation. And all of these stories, plus the stories of Marco Polo and all these stories, that's why people think the way they think. And then I also have stories that I've taken from Shia works, also saying terrible things about him and so on and so forth. This Abu Firas and so on and so forth. Many, many things, all along the same lines and so on and so forth, which, say these, incredible things about him. And all of this leads to where we are now, which is that people have this very bad idea of him. But was he this person? And I argue, no, he wasn't this person. This was not who he was at all. I don't know who he was. Huh? I mean, there are certain parts of it that are true and certain parts of it not true. But for the majority, all of these stories, from Idris Shah to Peter Lamborn Wilson, and Marco Polo and William Burroughs and Bernard Lewis and all these people, they're fictions. For what reason, I don't really understand. But they wanted to paint this man in a certain way. And I believe that they want to paint this man in this way because this idea that he espoused of freedom and justice and mercy and these values were not and are not accepted by contemporary Muslims or by certainly contemporary Western society. Western society is always talking about civilization, Western civilization, as though they're the most uncivilized of people, in truth. We can see from, look at the Afghan war. Look at the war in Afghanistan. I heard this Afghan man saying, we believe, because it's in the Quran, of the law of an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. It's in the Quran. First of all, there were no Afghans on these planes. Why did they attack them? Because of this, supposedly, right? There were no Afghans on that plane or any of those planes. Yet they attacked Afghanistan. And they've killed thousands and thousands of people. So it's not an eye for an eye because only 3,000, not only, but 3,000 plus people died in these buildings, which has never been proved that we did anything to do with it, but let's just say that. And they've killed tens of thousands of people for those 3,000 people. So this Afghan man was talking and says, yeah, we believe in an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, but not 10 eyes for one eye and 10 teeth for one tooth. In other words, it's out of proportion. But they keep telling us, you guys are terrorists, but they're the terrorists. Americans are terrorists. They fought 86 wars since the independence of the country. They fought that war against the British, and then they carried out, racial terrorism against the Indians, and just as the Zionists do in Palestine, what's it called? Something cleaning? Genocide? No, it's called cleaning, ethnic cleaning. They involved themselves in the ethnic cleaning of the American Indians. And these are the people who tell us, we're civilized. You guys are, terrorists. We're civilized. It's like I said before, like I listened to this press conference of Hillary Clinton, and she's talking about the leader in Syria, who's a bloodthirsty tyrant, no doubt about it. And he says, you have blood on your hands. He does have blood on his hands. But she's standing up to her waist in blood. So how do you calculate these things? So the idea is to flip the picture again and show them, these bloodthirsty assassins, these are the problem. Take the problem out of here and put it over there. divert the people's attention, and not to explain to people what was this man trying to do. And what he was trying to do is just what Nasser Khusro was trying to do. He was carrying on a defensive struggle to maintain this TAZ, this temporary autonomous zone, against people who were trying to destroy it. Why did Nasser Khusro wind up in Badakhshan? Badakhshan, as I said before, is the end of the world. Why, when he came back, did they push him and push him and push him all the way out to the end of Badakhshan? Why? Because they did not want to hear what he had to say. And they didn't want to hear what Hassan Sabah wanted to say. But Hassan Sabah was more organized in his thinking in a certain way and figured out a way to defend himself and his people against that. His theory was called cut off the head of the snake. In other words, if you're confronted with a superior military power, you can't compete. The Ismailis could not compete. They could not compete against the Sunnis. They could not compete against the Nasseris. They could not compete against the Crusaders. They didn't have the wherefore to do that. But so what they understood was the way you compete is you don't form another army. This is called, by the way, asymmetrical warfare. If you read contemporary books, called asymmetrical warfare. It's the same thing that allows the people, for instance, in Afghanistan and Iraq, to plant bombs by the side of a road. This way, you keep them off their feet at all the times, because terror is random. You don't know where it's going to come from, right? So you keep them off balance at all times. That's one part of it. The other part of it is kill the generals, kill the leaders. Because by killing the generals and killing the leaders, you cut the head off the snake. If I kill the king, then all of the king's courtiers are going to be fighting with each other for 10 years to who's going to be the next king. So I got a breathing space. Well, these guys fight it out. This is what asymmetrical warfare was. They weren't there. They weren't attacking anybody. It's like Iran. You look at Iran. Iran is surrounded by 78 bases. You try to look at the history of Iran. When did Iran last attack a nation or a country? 500 years, 600 years, something like that, 700 years. But suddenly Iran is this very dangerous thing that's going to attack us all. They're going to fly bomb. They may, if they get this thing, they may bomb New York, you know, I mean, because now they have missiles that they can put up with satellites, and so they can put a bomb and they can do that and that. But it's not their history. But this is the way it's told. And so you can imagine the United States surrounded by 78 bases all over Canada, all over Mexico, all over the Caribbean. There were bases with weapons aimed at the United States. How long do you think that would go on? It wouldn't go on, right? I mean, they wouldn't accept that. But they want the Iranians to accept that. But it doesn't make sense. It doesn't make sense. So these people, they call them Sufis and so on and so forth like that. They're actually very forward-thinking people who are trying to understand, because that's the same problem in Palestine. You say that, okay, land, you can buy land. You can buy land wherever you are. Let's say there's a free world. So it means I can buy land wherever I go, I can buy land. So at the time of 1948, how much land in the state of Palestine was owned by Jews? 18%. But the English, who have nothing to do with Palestine, they live on a little island up in the northwest, right? That's Great Britain. I call it Little Britain, right? They decided that this land belonged to the Jews in return for, in the First World War, the Jews moving their money to the English and supporting the English in their fight against the Germans, which is why Hitler turned against the Jews. All of this is understandable once you understand what was going on. But that's what they don't want you to understand. By any means, to understand what these things are underneath it. So Hassan Sabah is like that. Like, how can the Palestinians survive? How can they survive? They can't survive. Every day they say talk, talk, talk. Yes, okay, talk, 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 and they build more and more settlements, which means their lands become smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller. And this is what happens. What do you do? And you look at it, and there's this huge military might, plus behind them is the Americans. How can they win? Can they win? No way. No way. So the thing of understanding these people is understanding, this is one way that they understood it, which is that if you want to conduct a struggle against people who are trying to steal your life and your ways and everything like that, you have to adopt these principles if you want to do it, because it's the only way of doing it. And that's why it's relevant to the present, and that's why it's suppressed. It's suppressed because they don't want these ideas to be understood. Like Dr. Drami just came in, excuse me using your name, Dr. Somebody else just came in, right? He was at this civilized event. This is the graduation from the university. And we're told this represents civilization. Civilization. And these young people are going there to be civilized and learn to be civilized people. But are they really? That's the question. You see. So my point in all of this is trying to cause you to understand people there and people here, that when you hear these stories, you cannot take them at face value. You cannot take what these people say to be the truth, because they have no incentive to tell you the truth about these things. And on the contrary, they have every incentive to put a myth in your mind about who these people were. Because what they're saying, when you really get down to what is Hassan Sabah saying, what is Amir Khusro saying, what they're saying is that nothing matters in that sense. That's what he was talking about. They put this doubt in your mind, and so nothing matters about who you are, where you come from, how much money you have. These are the things, like, people are judged in this country on the basis of having money. You know that, and I know that. The more money you have, the better you are. The bigger your house, the better you are. The blonder your wife, the better you are. These are the values that they hold to be the values, with very few exceptions. So what does that tell a young child who's going to school? What does that tell a young man who's going to college? What is there to go for? Money. Money, cars, like Dr. Minhas says, you know, he sits and talks with the doctors. They talk about money, they talk about women, they talk about cars, and they talk about houses. He gets out and he goes running. Because it's boring. I didn't study, you know, to be a doctor, to listen to such nonsense. But this is what's held up in front of our children as being what to aim for, and even in front of the Muslims. Like, a Muslim family that has a doctor is better than a Muslim family that has a cab driver. They say Muslims are democratic. But you talk to any Muslim and they tell you, you want your son to be a taxi driver or a doctor? A doctor. Whether it's in Egypt or Pakistan or wherever you are, that's the person who has the clout. This is the value that's held forth. What these people are saying, no, that's not the value. The value is a spiritual value of returning to this absolute pure state in which Allah created you. That is the purpose of life. That's the purpose of life. That's what what Nasser Khusro is saying, that's what Hassan Sabah is saying, that's what these Ismailis were saying, and especially that's what the Fatimids were saying. It does not matter what you are in that sense. What it matters is, can you or will you or do and take your life and return to this fitra, return to this state of purity, return to the way Allah created you. That is the only thing of value, because the Prophet said, this life is nothing more than somebody who takes a rest underneath a tree for a few minutes like this and then gets up and walks on. That's when you die, you realize your life in this world was like that. Like that. Past like that. That's what you're going to realize. That's what I'm going to realize. This life is like that. And the only thing of value, it doesn't mean you can't earn money. It doesn't mean you can't become a doctor. Fine, become a doctor, an engineer, whatever you want, but understand that the only thing of value is to return to that pure state in which you were originally created. That is the purpose of your life. And all the things that Allah gave, like salat, and like zakat, like tahir, like any of those things that He gave to you, are not for Allah. What kind of difference does it make? Because some people walk around with this idea that Allah is this big guy up in heaven with a big long white beard. He has this big book and He's marking you off. Like when you pray your salat, did you touch the back of your ears? Or if you only went like this, well then your ajr is cut down like that. Did you put your hands in the right place? Did you do this or did you do that, or you did this or that? And He's marking it off in the book, like that. That's not what it's about. This is a method perfected. If you look at the Egyptian paintings, if you look at paintings from the ancient world, all of those postures of the salah, standing, bowing, sajda, and everything like that, these are spiritual exercises that bring about a change in the human being. You're not praying for Allah. What does Allah need your prayers for? He doesn't need your prayers. You're not going to make Him any bigger or any smaller. He's Allah. But you will be changed by it. He says, Ikra. Ikra bismillah rabbika alladhi khalaq. Ikra. Don't read for me. He wants you to read for you. Why? Because He assembled the Quran in such a way that there's sounds in the Quran. This we call the sonic theology. There's sounds in the Quran. And by the reading of these sounds, and by the making them come out of your mouth, not reading inside your head, but making them come out of your mouth, making your body, making your stomach and your lungs and everything make these sounds, it changes you. It alters you in a way that you can, and that's why we said we give you these practices. Yes, you're okay. You may not realize the benefit of them in 1 year, or 2 years, or 3 years, or 5, or maybe 10 years even. But believe me, sooner or later you will understand that it has changed you. You're a different person. Similarly with washing and making wudu. It just looks like, oh, you're doing this and you're doing that. Well, that can be a most unthinking action. Like this, bang, I'm out. I finished my wudu. But if you deeply make this thing and understand how you read Ghazali's The Mysteries of wudu, and you understand, like washing your mouth, like the things you say every day that you shouldn't have said. All of us do that. There's things we say we should never have said. How do we get rid of those things? We wash our mouths of them. We wash our ears from the things we shouldn't have heard. We wash our hands from the things we shouldn't have touched. We wash our feet from the places we shouldn't have walked. This is for us, wudu. Do you think Allah is marking you down whether you wiped your bottom or not? Do you think that's the level that Allah is at? No, of course not. But for you it is, because you become pure. The idea is to become pure. How to become pure. So He uses this simple thing with this very simple element which exists all over the world, whether it's in Africa or it's Asia or China or Australia or North America or South America or Europe. Water. Simple thing. You can use this to purify yourself. You can learn how to you can learn these things like this, how to do that. Money. Everybody worships money. Learn to give money away by sadaqah. That's one way. understand that you have to pay money. That's zakat. Zakat is not a gift from the heart. Zakat, you gotta pay. You gotta pay it. And you learn that there are certain people in this world, that students and orphans and widows and so on and so forth, like that, 7 groups of people, travelers and so on and so forth, who are entitled to money. They're entitled to your money, my money, just by dint of their being. But what do you have to do? You have to reach down into your pocket, right? You go down into your pocket. You go down into your pocket, you know. You open up the thing and say, you know, Atinat al-Kautar, you know, because Allah increases your thing. And you got to look in there and you got to see these things, you know, like this. And you got to give it away. You got to give it away. Right? Because people are deserving of your money. And even if you have nothing, I was walking down the street in Cairo, and there was this poor old man. Well, he was old then, and he's probably younger than I am by now, you know, but this poor old man, he's eating a plate of beans. And he tells me, Fadl, Fadl, sit down and eat. That's all he has to eat. He didn't have anything else to eat but those beans. But he's telling me, I'll feed you my beans. I'll give you my beans because you're my fellow human being, right? You deserve to eat. So these lessons, what these people are telling you, these lessons, and this has nothing to do with what your sect is, and your Muslim, your Shias or Sunnis or your Salafis or Sufis or whatever. Like, it has nothing to do with that. It has to do with the actions by which you can become a perfect, as close as possible to becoming a perfect human being. What university teaches that? None. They don't teach you that. What high school teaches you that? None. Grade school? None. Little bits maybe. Not much. Only Islam in the world today has this system whereby human beings can be taught to become perfect human beings. That's the only thing. If I wanted to open a university, a university for healing, university for learning fiqh. You know, there's a big graduation today at the what is it called? The Zaytuna Institute, right? They taught them fiqh. Okay, it's good to know about fiqh, but better to know about how to purify yourself, how to perfect yourself, and taught with that in mind, not knowing that, you know, well, in this year, this hadith is sahih and so on and so forth, and this is, you know, this has this and that has that and that has this. That's not the point. The point is, how do you purify yourself? And that's what Hassan Sabat was trying to do. He created a place called Alamut, and in this place he ran a school, just as Khusro ran a school in Badakhshan. He continued it. You know, it's like I told you about this man who used to be the chief of Sayyida Zainab Masjid in Egypt. It's a big, high position. He's a graduate of Azhar. He did something, said something the government didn't like. He used to drive to work with 4 motorcycles, 2 in front and 2 in back, Mercedes-Benz car. So they fire him, Ministry of Al-Qaf. They sent him to a little village in Upper Egypt. Well, we went to go visit some maqam, and we went and visited him. So there he is in this little village, in a dirt floor masjid. We went to visit, we got there and we prayed with them, we prayed the Maghrib with them, and they finished the Maghrib, I don't know exactly when it was, like that, it was in the evening, and he begins his class, he's teaching. He's teaching, he's not, well, last week, 2 weeks ago, I was in Sayyida Zainab, I'm on top of the world, now I'm in this masjid, in this place like that, I'm still doing the same thing. Still doing the same thing. You can't subvert me by giving me this or giving me that or taking away this or taking away that. Because what I'm working for is for Allah. I'm not working for the dunya. What can the dunya give me? Nothing. Really. That is of any lasting value. Because nothing here, as Allah says, كُلُّ مَنْ عَلَيْهَا فَانٍ وَيَبْقَى وَجْهُ رَبِّكَ ذُو الْجَلَالِ وَالْإِكْرَامِ. Everything in this earth is bound to destruction, except the wajh of Allah. So I want the wajh of Allah. I want to have a school teach people, seek the wajh of Allah. Seek the happiness of Allah. Seek Allah. Seek these things. Don't worry about becoming the richest guy on the block. And for this reason, they found ways to paint him dark, to hide his teaching, and like this. And the same with his man from 3 generations earlier. And that's what my talk is about. This is, there are few people, some of the Sufis who came to India, and some of the ones like this, and some of the Imams, and, various of these people who adhere to that teaching. Adhere to that teaching. This is what we want. We don't care about your fancy dress. We don't care about your imma. We don't care about any of this stuff. You can have the biggest imma in the world and the most decorated, embroidered, you see these guys with gold going down their things. And what? There's a guy who lives in his room. You know what his rooms were? He had a library and a bedroom. That's all he had. He lived in them all of his life, and he devoted his life to writing and like that, and running this thing and keeping it going and so forth like that. And if anybody tried to pull any funny business, maybe I might even give the second part of the talk. I know there are very important things that we do have to talk about that I didn't talk about. And one of the things that destroyed it, and nearly destroyed it, which is what is called the Qiyamah al-Kubra. Qiyamah al-Kubra. This is something that has to be understood. And at this point, this is like 3rd generation, 4th generation. There's a question, Hassan Sabah is dead. And what happened to Nizar's son? Nizar is the one who has the Nas. So he has a son, and the son has a son, and the son has a son, and the son has a son, but they're living in exile in Persia. At one point, it's the middle of Ramadan, and they think that he's the son of the Buzurg Umid, who is one of the people who have been appointed by Hassan Sabah to run things. And I hope that you can understand by this time, that I've taken a lot of time to try to destroy these myths of rabid killers and drugs and beautiful girls, all that stuff. You don't believe that that's what I'm talking about, right? I'm not talking about that, okay? And the other things I'm talking about, I think you can share the necessity for the purification of the self. But they made a fatal error. There was a fatal error that was made. And that error was made by a man who declared himself to be the Imam. He declared himself to be the Imam. I'm the Imam. And actually, I am the great-grandson of Nizar. But I've been in hiding. My father took care of me, and my grandfather, like that. When Nizar was killed by these people who attacked him, he remained, right? And so you were kept in hiding in like this. And so finally, he's going to give a talk in Ramadan. And the whole thing is all set up for it. And he comes down, and he's in the center of the courtyard, and he tells everybody, to much to their surprise, actually, I'm the Imam. I'm the Imam. You don't realize it, but I am. And more than that, and this is how I am, right? We had to keep this under wraps all this time, hidden. Now, now is the time. It's the 17th of Ramadan. Now is the time. we're going to go beyond all of that. I'm going to bring you up to date. And I'm the Imam. So you can trust what I say is true. Right? Because Imam doesn't lie. He's Masoom. He tells them, I'll read you what he says. This is the conclusion of the talk. He says to them, and this is why, by the way, I always, in my talks, talk about this ayat from Surah Baqarah 143. جَعَلَكُمْ أُمَّةً وَسَطًا لِتَكُونُوا شُهَدَاءَ عَلَى النَّاسِ وَيَكُونَ الرَّسُولُ عَلَيْكُمْ شَهِيدًا. We made you to be a community of the middle. Ummatan wasatan. And Hassan Sabah kept him always on that middle thing. So suddenly now this is changing. He's saying, okay, this is who I am. He explains how it happened. It's possible. Indeed, it's possible. He could have been who he said he was. And he sets up this whole thing. This is on the 7th day of Ramadan. And he comes out and he talks to them, and the whole talk is in Arabic. Because they thought that he was the son of this general that Hassan Sabah had brought in to take care of things. That's who they thought he was. And suddenly he gets up and he says he's speaking to them in perfect Fasiha, perfect Arabic. Now it's unlikely that the son of a general, Persian general, can speak Arabic like that. Unlikely. And the first thing he says, Salam, Salam, Salam. And then he tells them, I'm trying to find the exact, because I'm jumping around here. Forgive me. He said, O you inhabitants of the worlds, jinn, men, malaik, the 3 inhabitants, know that your Maulana, the Qaim al-Qiyamat, the Lord of Resurrection, is with you. I am the Lord of absolute being. I have nothing to do with denominations or determinations. I transcend them all. In the story, you know that when Imam Mahdi comes, he explains to every religion the truth of their thing, right? He explained to Buddhists their truth, Hindus their truth, the Muslims. Many Muslims won't believe in him. Christians their truth. He explains everywhere. So he says, I'm beyond all of that. I'm going to talk to you now in truth. I send you my blessings, my compassion, and I have called you to be my specially selected servants. I transcend by living on the threshold of His mercy, Allah's mercy. Through the light of His knowledge, I speak. I cause you to see and to hear and to speak for all of eternity. Know that my imamate is true. It will never go astray. It will never become changed. It will never become altered. It is preserved by the posterity of Maulana Ali alayhi salam. It will never be disassociated from them in appearance or in meaning or reality. Then he told everybody, sit down. And they looked and they saw that there was a big table filled with food and wine. And he says, eat. Break your fast. It's the middle of the day on the 17th day of Ramadan. It's all over now. You've succeeded. Eat. If you want to go, go. It's like in the night in Karbala, when Sayyidina Hussein alayhi salam told the people, you don't want to stick with me on this thing, you're free to leave. He told him, you don't want to go along with this, go. But any of you who believe me, stay. Sit down and eat. This, yani, is impossible. Now the batin has overtaken the zahir. The balance is broken. Before this we had the balance between zahir and batin. By one swoop, he has changed the whole thing. Incidentally, 4 years later he's murdered. That's as long as he lasted. And this is what happened. This is the changing from the Dawra Satr to the Dawra Kashf. Yani from the time of being veiled to the time of everything's out front. I'm telling you out front now, you don't need to do this anymore. You don't need to fast anymore. You don't need to pray anymore. You don't need to pay zakat. You don't need to do any of these things. If you want to, go ahead, fine. I won't stop you from doing it, it's fine. But it's not incumbent upon you anymore. It's over. We've reached a point in this place and time where that's done. That's the hardest thing to understand. I leave you with that. I leave you with that. I leave you with that. Assalamu alaikum. I've had half an hour. Oh, I'm tired of people out. Yes. Salam. Have a safe trip. You'll be back?